Gilbert Ryle stands as one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, particularly in the areas of philosophy of mind and epistemology. He is perhaps best known for his critique of Cartesian dualism, which had been a dominant perspective in Western philosophy since Descartes. Ryle's attack on dualism was groundbreaking, presenting a challenge that reshaped how philosophers approach the mind-body problem. His most celebrated work, The Concept of Mind, 1949, offered a novel perspective on mental phenomena by arguing against the idea that the mind is a separate, immaterial substance. Instead, Ryle proposed that mental states should be understood through their manifestation in behavior, a position that aligned closely with behaviorism and later functionalist ideas in the philosophy of mind. While Ryle's work is undeniably centered around the philosophy of mind, his influence spans across numerous areas of philosophy, including epistemology, ethics, and philosophy of language. This video will explore the philosophical influences that shaped Ryle's thinking, focusing on how he was influenced by contemporaneous philosophical movements such as logical positivism, ordinary language philosophy, and the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. We will delve into the central ideas in the concept of mind, examining Ryle's challenge to Cartesian dualism and his argument that mental states cannot be considered in isolation from behavior. This discussion will also explore how Ryle's work helped redefine the direction of philosophy of mind in the 20th century, influencing later philosophers such as Daniel Dennett and others who contributed to the development of functionalism. By examining Ryle's inspirations, his philosophical developments, and his long-lasting impact on contemporary philosophy, this essay will present a comprehensive view of why Ryle remains a pivotal figure in modern philosophical thought. 2. The life of Gilbert Ryle. Early life and education. Gilbert Ryle was born in Brighton, England, in 1900 to a family with a strong intellectual background. From a young age, he showed an aptitude for academic endeavors and developed an interest in philosophy during his early education. After attending Eton College, a prestigious British institution, Ryle went on to study at Christ Church, Oxford, one of the leading universities in the world, where he completed a degree in modern history and philosophy. Although initially focused on history, Ryle was drawn to philosophy and soon became captivated by the analytic tradition, a movement that was gaining momentum at Oxford during the early 20th century. Ryle's academic development was shaped by his exposure to some of the most prominent philosophers of his time. At Oxford, he studied under philosophers such as G. E. Moore, who was known for his careful analytic approach to philosophical problems, and J. L. Austin, who would become one of the central figures in the ordinary language philosophy movement. These figures, along with Ryle's own intellectual curiosity, laid the foundation for Ryle's later work, particularly his commitment to the clarity of language and his rejection of speculative metaphysics. In addition to his formal academic education, Ryle's early philosophical development was influenced by his engagement with the contemporary debates in the philosophy of mind and epistemology. This intellectual environment, especially at Oxford, allowed Ryle to refine his understanding of the limitations of traditional metaphysical philosophy and set him on a course to challenge the prevailing views on the nature of the mind and knowledge. Academic career and major works. Ryle's academic career was long and distinguished. After completing his studies at Oxford, Ryle returned to the university as a fellow at Magdalen College, where he remained for much of his life. During this time, he not only engaged in teaching philosophy but also published numerous influential works. His most famous and enduring contribution to philosophy is his 1949 book The Concept of Mind, in which he critiques Descartes' dualism and develops a novel approach to understanding mental states. In addition to his book on the philosophy of mind, Ryle also wrote numerous essays and delivered lectures on topics related to knowledge, language, and the nature of philosophical problems. Throughout his career, Ryle was committed to maintaining a clear and accessible style in his writing, which helped him become a popular and influential teacher at Oxford. His lectures on the philosophy of mind, especially his critiques of dualism, garnered widespread attention and became central to many discussions in the philosophy of mind and epistemology. Ryle's academic career also included influential engagements with other prominent philosophers of his time. His participation in the Oxford philosophy community, as well as his interactions with figures such as J.L. Austin, John Searle, and others, helped solidify his reputation as a leading figure in the philosophy of mind. Intellectual context and philosophical development. Ryle's intellectual context was largely defined by the rise of analytic philosophy, a movement that sought to bring clarity and precision to philosophical problems through logical analysis and careful attention to language. Philosophers in this tradition, including G.E. Moore and Ludwig Wittgenstein, argued that many philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings or confusions about the meanings of words and concepts. Ryle's work was deeply influenced by this approach, and his focus on ordinary language as a means of resolving philosophical puzzles was a hallmark of his philosophy. Furthermore, Ryle was critical of the metaphysical and speculative approaches that had dominated traditional philosophy, particularly the dualism proposed by Descartes. He sought to move away from abstract theorizing and instead to focus on how language and behavior could provide insight into the nature of the mind and human cognition. 3. Ryle's critique of Cartesian dualism. The background of Cartesian dualism. René Descartes' dualism had a profound impact on the development of modern philosophy. Descartes posited that there were two distinct substances in the universe, the mind and the body. The mind, or soul, was an immaterial, thinking substance that existed apart from the body, which was a material, extended substance. According to Descartes, the mind could exist independently of the body, and it was the seat of reason, thought, and consciousness. This separation of the mind from the body became known as Cartesian dualism, and it influenced much of Western philosophy for centuries. Descartes' famous dictum, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was intended to establish a foundation for certain knowledge by asserting that the thinking mind, or the subject of thought, is indubitable. The body, on the other hand, was seen as subject to the laws of physics, and its movements could be explained by mechanical processes. This dualistic view was foundational to modern thought but also raised many problems, particularly in explaining how the immaterial mind could interact with the material body. Ryle's main critique in the concept of mind. In the concept of mind, Ryle's most influential work, he critiques Descartes' dualism and introduces his own theory of the mind. Ryle argues that Descartes' separation of the mind and body is a conceptual error, what Ryle refers to as a category mistake. According to Ryle, the Cartesian view mistakenly treats the mind as if it were an object or substance in the same way that the body is, and this leads to unnecessary metaphysical confusion. Ryle's critique focuses on the idea that Descartes' dualism fails to account for how mental states are reflected in behavior. For Ryle, mental states are not separate, inner phenomena that require additional explanation but are instead dispositions to behave in certain ways. Ryle uses the famous metaphor of the ghost in the machine to describe the Cartesian view. The mind is imagined to be an immaterial ghost that inhabits and controls the material machine of the body. This metaphor, according to Ryle, is not only misleading but also fails to provide a coherent understanding of how the mind works. Ryle's central claim is that mental states should be understood through their observable effects, that is, through behavior. For example, if we say someone knows how to ride a bike, we are not referring to an inner, immaterial mental event but to a set of skills and behaviors that can be observed in action. Ryle thus challenges the Cartesian view of the mind as something hidden and separate from the body, arguing instead that mental states should be understood as part of the integrated system of human behavior. The impact of Ryle's critique. Ryle's critique of Cartesian dualism had far-reaching implications for the philosophy of mind. His work provided a powerful alternative to the traditional dualist framework and laid the groundwork for future theories, such as behaviorism and functionalism, that sought to explain mental states in terms of behavior and the functions they serve. Ryle's rejection of Cartesian dualism helped shift the focus of philosophical inquiry away from abstract metaphysical debates about the nature of the mind and towards a more empirical, behaviorist approach. This shift had a profound impact on psychology and cognitive science, where behaviorism and later functionalism became central theories in understanding mental processes. Furthermore, Ryle's critique paved the way for later developments in philosophy of mind, including the exploration of cognitive states in terms of their functional roles within larger systems, as seen in the work of philosophers like Daniel Dennett and others. 4. Philosophical influences on Ryle. The logical positivists and early behaviorism. Ryle was deeply influenced by the logical positivists, a group of philosophers associated with the Vienna Circle, who emphasized the importance of empirical verification and rejected metaphysical speculation. Figures such as A.J. Ayer and Carnap were concerned with the meaning of statements and their empirical verification, particularly in relation to the sciences. Logical positivism encouraged a focus on observable phenomena and the rejection of non-empirical claims. This emphasis on clarity and verification resonated strongly with Ryle, who argued that mental states could be better understood through observable behavior. Ryle's work was also informed by early behaviorism, particularly the views of John B. Watson and B. F. Skinner. Behaviorism argued that psychology should focus on observable behavior, rather than internal mental states. For Ryle, behaviorism provided a framework for understanding mental phenomena as patterns of behavior, which could be analyzed scientifically and empirically. However, Ryle's version of behaviorism was more sophisticated than earlier versions, as he recognized the complexity of human action and emphasized the importance of social context and language in understanding behavior. Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Ryle's intellectual development was also influenced by the later work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, particularly philosophical investigations. Wittgenstein's later philosophy emphasized the importance of ordinary language in understanding the meaning of concepts. He argued that many traditional philosophical problems arise because philosophers misunderstand the way words are used in everyday contexts. Wittgenstein believed that rather than seeking abstract definitions, philosophers should examine how terms are used in ordinary life. Ryle adopted Wittgenstein's approach to language, using it to analyze the meanings of terms related to the mind. For Ryle, the meaning of mental concepts like belief or desire could be understood by examining how people use these terms in practice, particularly in relation to observable behavior. This focus on ordinary language was central to Ryle's philosophy and became a key feature of the ordinary language philosophy movement, which sought to dissolve philosophical puzzles by focusing on the ways in which words function in everyday life. Ordinary language philosophy. Ryle was a leading figure in the ordinary language philosophy movement, which emerged in the mid-20th century. Philosophers in this movement, including J. L. Austin, argued that many traditional philosophical problems arose because philosophers misinterpreted or misunderstood the way words function in ordinary language. By examining how people actually use words in normal contexts, ordinary language philosophers believed that many philosophical confusions could be clarified or dissolved. Ryle's focus on ordinary language was crucial to his critique of Cartesian dualism and his views on the mind. Rather than attempting to define mental states in terms of abstract metaphysical entities, Ryle encouraged philosophers to look at how people talk about the mind in everyday language. This focus on the practical use of language helped Ryle avoid the speculative pitfalls of earlier philosophical traditions and allowed him to develop a more empirically grounded approach to the philosophy of mind. 5. Ryle's philosophy of mind. Knowing how versus knowing that. One of the key contributions Ryle made to the philosophy of mind is his distinction between knowing how and knowing that. Ryle argued that knowledge is not merely a matter of possessing facts or propositions, knowing that, but also involves the ability to perform certain actions or skills, knowing how. For example, knowing how to swim is not simply a matter of knowing facts about swimming but also involves the ability to swim in practice. This distinction is important in Ryle's view of the mind. Rather than seeing mental states as private, internal events, Ryle argued that many forms of knowledge are better understood as patterns of behavior. The capacity to engage in certain actions, like solving a problem or playing a musical instrument, is as important to understanding the mind as possessing knowledge of facts. The concept of dispositions. Another key idea in Ryle's philosophy is the concept of dispositions. For Ryle, mental states are not isolated, non-physical entities but are better understood as dispositions to behave in certain ways. For instance, when someone believes something, they are disposed to act in certain ways that reflect their belief. Similarly, someone who desires to help others may be disposed to act in compassionate and helpful ways. Ryle's concept of dispositions challenges the Cartesian idea that mental states are private, hidden events. Instead, mental states are closely tied to observable behaviors, providing a more integrated view of the mind and body. This approach helped to shift the focus of philosophy of mind away from metaphysical speculations about the nature of the mind toward a more grounded, practical understanding of human cognition and behavior. 6. Ryle's influence on later philosophical thought. Ryle's work had a profound and lasting impact on the philosophy of mind. His rejection of Cartesian dualism influenced later thinkers, particularly in the development of functionalism, which sought to explain mental states in terms of their roles within larger systems. Ryle's emphasis on dispositions, behavior, and the social context of language also influenced later developments in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett, who developed the theory of functionalism, built on Ryle's critique of dualism by proposing that mental states should be understood in terms of their functional roles within the brain and nervous system. Furthermore, Ryle's work on ordinary language philosophy influenced later philosophers who sought to clarify philosophical problems by analyzing the way we use language in everyday life. Ryle's influence continues to be felt today, particularly in debates about the nature of consciousness, cognition, and behavior. His critique of dualism remains an essential part of the analytic tradition in philosophy of mind, and his focus on empirical, behavior-based approaches to understanding the mind has helped to shape the direction of modern philosophy and cognitive science. 8. Ryle's challenge to the mind-body problem. The historical context of the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem, one of the central issues in the philosophy of mind, asks how the mind and body are related. Historically, the most well-known approach to this problem was René Descartes' dualism, which posited that the mind, a non-material substance, and the body, a material substance, are distinct and interact with each other. However, this framework raised questions about how the mind, as an immaterial substance, could interact with the body, which operates according to the laws of physics. This problem became known as the interaction problem, and it is one of the key challenges that philosophers of mind have grappled with ever since. Ryle's work in the concept of mind directly addresses the mind-body problem, rejecting the Cartesian dualist framework in favor of a more integrated view of the mind. His critique of dualism involves challenging the very terms in which the mind-body problem has traditionally been framed. According to Ryle, the dualist conception of the mind as an immaterial substance separate from the body is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of mental states. Ryle's rejection of dualism. Ryle's rejection of dualism is rooted in his critique of what he called the category mistake of Cartesian philosophy. Descartes and other dualists, according to Ryle, mistakenly treated mental states like beliefs, desires, and emotions as if they were distinct, inner, and private phenomena in the same way that physical objects are distinct and external to us. In doing so, dualism creates a conceptual divide between the mind and the body that obscures the fact that mental states are not separate entities but are integrated with and exhibited in physical behavior. To Ryle, the Cartesian approach is flawed because it leads to the incorrect assumption that the mind must be some mysterious substance that is wholly distinct from the body. He argues that mental states are better understood as dispositions to act in certain ways rather than as independent mental objects. This position aligns with a behaviorist perspective, where mental phenomena are closely tied to observable behaviors. Ryle's challenge to the mind-body problem was not to deny that mental phenomena exist but to reconceptualize how we think about them. By emphasizing the importance of dispositions and behaviors in understanding the mind, Ryle offered an alternative to the dualist framework. His critique suggests that there is no need to separate the mind and body because mental states are inherently tied to how people behave in the world. This perspective refocused attention on human action and the observable manifestations of mental life, rather than abstract inner states. The impact of Ryle's challenge. Ryle's rejection of Cartesian dualism had a profound impact on the philosophy of mind, influencing later thinkers who sought to explain the relationship between mind and body in terms of function and behavior. His critique helped clear the way for the development of functionalism, a theory that views mental states in terms of their causal roles in a system rather than as isolated substances or objects. Ryle's work also played a significant role in the decline of behaviorism in the mid-20th century, as thinkers began to realize that understanding mental states in terms of behavior alone was insufficient for capturing the complexity of human cognition. While Ryle's approach was deeply behaviorist, his attention to the social and linguistic context in which mental states are expressed helped pave the way for more nuanced approaches in cognitive science, where the relationship between the mind, behavior, and the brain continues to be a central concern. Ryle's ability to reframe the mind-body problem without falling into metaphysical traps opened up new possibilities for understanding the mind in terms of function and observable behavior, shifting the focus of philosophical inquiry toward more empirical and scientifically grounded approaches. 9. The relationship between Ryle and Wittgenstein. The influence of Wittgenstein's early philosophy. One of the most important influences on Gilbert Ryle's thinking was the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, particularly his early work Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Wittgenstein's early philosophy was heavily influenced by logical positivism and sought to establish the limits of meaningful language through a rigorous analysis of logical form. He argued that many philosophical problems arise because language is used imprecisely or ambiguously, and that the meaning of a statement is tied to its ability to be empirically verified. Although Ryle's approach to language was less formal than Wittgenstein's, he shared Wittgenstein's conviction that philosophical problems often stem from misunderstandings about the use of words. This shared perspective on the role of language in philosophy helped to shape Ryle's later work, especially his emphasis on ordinary language philosophy. Wittgenstein's insistence that philosophy should aim at clarification rather than the discovery of hidden truths influenced Ryle's method of focusing on how words are used in ordinary contexts to address philosophical problems. The influence of Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Wittgenstein's later philosophy, as expressed in philosophical investigations, had a more direct and profound influence on Ryle's views on the mind. Wittgenstein's shift away from the logical rigor of his early work towards an exploration of the ordinary use of language resonated with Ryle's own philosophical aims. Wittgenstein argued that many traditional philosophical problems, including those about the nature of the mind, arise from confusions about how words are used in everyday life. In Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein proposed that the meaning of a word is grounded in its public use, and he introduced the concept of language games to describe how words acquire meaning through their use in specific social contexts. Ryle adopted Wittgenstein's ordinary language approach to tackle the problems in philosophy of mind, particularly the issue of mental states. For Ryle, mental terms such as belief, desire, and intention should not be understood as referring to inner, private states but as referring to patterns of behavior that are socially observable and meaningful within specific contexts. Ryle's focus on language games and the social context of language echoes Wittgenstein's ideas about the public and pragmatic nature of language. Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance. One of Wittgenstein's central ideas in his later work was the notion of family resemblance, the idea that concepts do not have a single essence but are connected through overlapping similarities, like members of a family who share traits but do not all have the same characteristics. This concept also influenced Ryle's thinking, particularly in relation to his analysis of mental concepts. For Ryle, mental states such as belief or desire cannot be pinned down to a single essence but instead reflect a range of behaviors and dispositions that vary depending on the context in which they are used. This understanding aligns with Wittgenstein's view that many philosophical problems arise from attempts to find one definitive essence for concepts that are inherently diverse. Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance helped Ryle approach mental states not as isolated, abstract entities but as complex patterns of behavior that emerge in different contexts. For example, the concept of knowing how to ride a bike is not defined by one essential characteristic but by a family of related abilities and behaviors. Ryle's theory of knowledge and mental states was thus informed by Wittgenstein's insights into how language works and how concepts derive their meaning from their use in particular social contexts. The legacy of Wittgenstein in Ryle's philosophy. Wittgenstein's later work continues to resonate in Ryle's philosophy, especially in Ryle's approach to analyzing mental concepts. Wittgenstein's emphasis on ordinary language and the social dimensions of meaning provided Ryle with the tools to argue against the Cartesian distinction between the mind and the body. Ryle's notion of knowing how versus knowing that can be seen as an extension of Wittgenstein's emphasis on the practical use of language and the idea that the meaning of words is shaped by their social and functional roles in everyday life. Wittgenstein's influence also extended to Ryle's critique of the mind-body problem. Just as Wittgenstein argued that philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings of language, Ryle argued that the mind-body problem could be dissolved by clarifying our concepts and understanding mental phenomena as dispositions to behave in certain ways. 10. Ryle's legacy in contemporary philosophical thought. Influence on contemporary philosophy of mind. Gilbert Ryle's work continues to have a significant influence on contemporary debates in the philosophy of mind. His rejection of Cartesian dualism and his focus on the relationship between language, behavior, and mental states laid the groundwork for many later developments in cognitive science, psychology, and philosophy of mind. Philosophers such as Daniel Dennett, who developed the theory of functionalism, have drawn on Ryle's critique of dualism to argue that mental states should be understood in terms of their causal roles within a system, rather than as isolated, inner phenomena. Ryle's emphasis on dispositional accounts of mental states, as opposed to representational or substance-based accounts, also resonates with contemporary approaches in cognitive science that focus on the functional and relational aspects of mental states. Today, many researchers and philosophers are concerned with understanding how cognitive states emerge from the interaction of neural networks and behavioral patterns, a question that is consistent with Ryle's dispositional analysis of the mind. Impact on behaviorism and cognitive science. Although Ryle's work was deeply connected to early behaviorism, it also anticipated developments in cognitive science by addressing how mental states are related to behavior without reducing mental life to mere stimulus-response patterns. Ryle's more sophisticated version of behaviorism, which emphasized the role of language and social context in understanding mental phenomena, provided a bridge to later developments in cognitive science. While he rejected the simplistic behaviorist view that mental states could be fully explained by observable behavior, he nonetheless played an important role in emphasizing the importance of studying behavior and rejecting metaphysical accounts of the mind. Ryle's critiques of dualism have also had a lasting impact on the development of artificial intelligence, AI, and the philosophy of cognitive science. In particular, his rejection of an immaterial, ghost-like mind has influenced debates about how to model cognition in machines and how to conceptualize consciousness in terms of computational functions rather than as an elusive, immaterial substance. Continued relevance in modern philosophy. Ryle's work remains an essential part of the analytic tradition and continues to be cited by philosophers addressing the mind-body problem, the nature of consciousness, and the relationship between language and thought. Philosophers who argue for a more functional or ecological view of cognition continue to draw on Ryle's emphasis on the practical, behavioral aspects of mental life. His influence is also seen in contemporary discussions about the relationship between human minds and artificial intelligence. Ryle's insistence that the mind is not a mysterious, separate entity from the body but rather a set of dispositions and behaviors has shaped discussions about how to understand and potentially replicate mental processes in machines. As AI research advances, Ryle's philosophy provides a key perspective in understanding the nature of cognition and intelligence in both humans and machines. Conclusion. Gilbert Ryle's contributions to the philosophy of mind are monumental and enduring. Through his critique of Cartesian dualism, his focus on the relationship between language, behavior, and mental states, and his emphasis on the empirical study of the mind, Ryle reshaped the landscape of 20th-century philosophy. His work helped move the philosophy of mind away from abstract, speculative metaphysics and toward more concrete, behaviorally grounded approaches. Ryle's legacy is evident not only in his own writings but in the continuing influence of his ideas on contemporary philosophy and cognitive science. His work remains central to ongoing discussions about the nature of the mind, consciousness, and human behavior.